Well, no shortage of things to talk about. Certainly, the top story this week, the campus protests going on across the country. Certainly, most Republicans are united in their opposition of these protests. Some dissension on the Democratic side, but generally speaking, the country watching what's happening on college campuses and seeing something I think that disturbs most Americans. And joining me to talk about what it is we're seeing here across the country on these college campuses is Eric Erickson. He's the host of the Eric Erickson Show, a terrific conservative commentator, and he's going to talk a little bit about that and some of the other issues going on across the country right now. Eric, thank you for joining me here on the DC Debrief. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, sir. And I think as we watch all of these protests happening across the country, it's we really have been seeing this starting to accelerate. And what started off as a pro-Palestinian protests on some campuses by some students has seemed to just explode, resulting in police now moving in, having armed confrontations with these protesters who are vandalizing school buildings and occupying places illegally. What is your take on what it is we're seeing right now here across college campuses across America?
This is becoming a pattern with the left. It's like a summer of riots. Every time it starts to warm up, they begin to riot. We've seen this in 2020. We've seen it in 2022 around election season. They get agitated about something. This time it's the Israel-Gaza situation. What's really striking to me, though, this time is the denial by people in the media in particular covering them that there's anti-Semitism or any sort of harassment of Jews. And yet the videos that come out of the campuses show that they're blocking Jewish students from libraries. They're locking Jewish students in the library. They're harassing them on their way to campus. They're denying them access to campus. There is a virulent anti-Semitism here. They say it's about Zionists, but apparently all Jews are Zionists. The level of hatred. Also, what is also striking to me is it's very clear there are people from off campus coming in, agitated and riling up the students, helping them organize. They're not all just spontaneously going out and getting tents from REI. Someone's bringing them in. And additionally, what's notable is the coldness towards the situation in Israel. For example, one Jewish student got his video camera out and went and asked all the students on his campus who were protesting, should the hostages be released? Most refused to answer, but those who did said no. There's a level of lack of empathy for the hostages in Israel, and this is what we're seeing from an increasingly violent left.
And you mentioned the outside agitators. I know that even New York Mayor Eric Adams talked about that was one of the main reasons why police went into Columbia University. They were obviously asked by the school to go in and clear the protesters from the administrative building that they were holding. But talking about the fact that these were people from outside the campus, these were not students who had illegally taken over an administrative building, and that was the main reason why they went in. How to what degree, to what level do you think outside agitators are invading in these protests?
Well, it's a convenient excuse for the left to say, well, it's outside agitators. One of the leaders was a student at Columbia, the one whose video was exposed of him saying all Zionists need to die, they're Nazis, we should kill them. So he's there organizing, and now Columbia's like, oh, it's not our students, it's not people affiliated. Well, he was your student last week, you just conveniently expelled him, so you can now say he's not your student. There are people on the outside, and that shouldn't be minimized. But also, we shouldn't minimize the fact that it's a lot of students on campus who are involved as well. The left is trying to cover here, and they're trying to move the goalposts and say, well, it's outsiders. Yes, but they've co-opted a willing group of students to participate. So you do have a lot of Ivy League students, and this is damage control from progressives trying to claim it's not the students. Actually, what's so funny is on Fareed Zakaria on CNN, they had a professor from Columbia come on and say, well, y'all are covering the people outside the tent encampment, claiming that it's people inside the tent encampment. I've been there. I've seen no anti-Semitism. And yet, literally the same day is video of these students in the camp, clearly at Columbia, chanting Palestine will be liberated, river to sea, an explicit Hamas call for the genocide of Jews.
How should universities be handling this situation?
Like Ben Sass at the University of Florida, who sent out a memo and said, you can protest, you've got free speech, but if you camp, if you harass, if you bully, if you commit acts of vandalism, not only are you getting expelled, but the professors who participate are getting fired, and shut down the protests at the University of Florida. There are ways to handle this grown up. The University of Chicago, has allowed free speech on their campus, and both sides places to protest can counter protest so long as it was peaceful. And the moment there were acts of violence, they shut it down. You can learn a lot, I think, from SEC schools, frankly, where we're not seeing this agitation except in limited circumstance, as opposed to the Ivies and the Big Ten schools, where the professors and the universities have coddled the protesting students to the point the students think they can get away with it. Northwestern is probably the prime example of what not to do, where they negotiated with the students on how to proceed and who they should let on campus and whether they should create a committee to divest from Israel. You don't negotiate with these sorts of student terrorists.
Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi earlier this week talked about potential protests at the Democratic National Convention and worries that that could affect the public opinion of President Biden and his ability to have a handle on the situation. How damaging are these protests for President Biden politically and for Democrats in general?
The Democrats are consoling themselves, saying, well, a majority of Americans support a ceasefire. Well, yes, but a majority of Americans support a ceasefire after the return of the hostages, which these students don't care about and don't want. I think it does define the Democrats. Everyone goes back to 1968, the Democratic Convention in Chicago. The difference is you had Mayor Daley then who sent the police in to crack down on the protesters, and that got a lot of coverage. Now you've got a mayor who is sympathetic to the student protesters, doesn't like the police, and doesn't like Israel. So we're going to see how this plays out in Chicago. It could be like the Purge 2024 in Chicago if the Democrats aren't careful. The corollary here is they may crack down on the protesters and enforce the law, which then raises the question of why aren't they doing it in other big cities? There's not a good way for the Democrats to win. The only thing they have going for them is so much of the mainstream media is sympathetic to their cause, they'll try to downplay whatever happens.
Moving to a different subject now, I want to talk about the House the foreign aid bill that was signed by the president last week, and more specifically the aid to Ukraine, which a lot of conservative Republicans were vehemently against. Marjorie Taylor Greene, chief among them. She's earned the nickname Moscow Marge or Moscow Margie. I forget exactly what it is, but it seems as though, and there have been some that have argued that Russian propaganda is kind of infiltrating some of the GOP conservative base. Do you believe that that's true? And if so, how big a problem do you think this is?
I don't think it's a big problem, but I do think there is an issue. For example, one of the talking points that's circulated out there is that actually the Russians are on the side of the Christians, the Ukrainians are abusing Christians, torturing Christians. I've heard Marjorie Taylor Greene make those sorts of claims. That actually is Russian propaganda. In fact, there have been American missional church groups who've gone in and interviewed pastors, and overwhelmingly, it's the Russians who are killing the Protestant pastors. 400 Baptist congregations eliminated. The Greek Catholic Church wiped out, the priests killed, the congregants killed. Presbyterian and Methodist pastors have escaped from Russian-controlled territory and talked about how they were tortured and abused. I mean, we've actually got the video evidence of these American pastors and the missionaries that we funded who were being tortured not by the Ukrainians but by the Russians. And also the idea that the Ukrainians are getting wiped out. That's something that the Russians are saying that isn't true. So there are concerns about where we're getting this from. My favorite is that we've run out of weapons and we can't afford to give them to Ukraine. That's actually Russian propaganda. It's simply not true. We're giving the Ukrainians our old technology, and we're using the money Ukraine is sending us to build new technology for ourselves. I've got concerned with the funding. I supported it, but I do think we need a way out. We need a way to control it. Russia has much more resources than Ukraine. We need to find a way to try to wind this down and also make sure the funding's not being corrupted by Ukraine. At the same time, this is a war for their survival. The Russians want to spread and rebuild an Eastern European sphere of influence. We're allowing the Ukrainians to stop the Russians instead of our sons and daughters stopping it. And we're live testing weapon systems that we've developed to use against the Chinese or the Russians in Ukraine and allowing the Ukrainians to test it against the latest Russian and Chinese technology. And with very few exceptions, we're finding our weapon systems are able to keep up with the Russians and the Chinese. And that's good for us because of what's coming. The Russians and Chinese clearly building an axis of Eastern powers to rival us. We need to have a sense of where we stand versus them, and Ukraine gives us that.
As part of the foreign aid bill, too, there was also legislation in there that would force TikTok's owners to divest from China because there is the security concerns of TikTok users having their data scraped by the Chinese. Do you think divesting the owners divesting from China, will it help keep users safe from foreign threats or unnecessarily impinge on free speech?
Yeah, I don't think it's a free speech issue because we're not threatening to shut down TikTok. That's on ByteDance if they don't want to sell. But there's no doubt we've got the data to show that China has been using TikTok to not just surveil Americans, but to push disinformation to American kids, to twist American kids on transgenderism, on the Israel Palestine situation, and other situations like that to indoctrinate our kids. They're also using it to spy on journalists. They're using it to follow Americans around. There are a lot of people who say, well, I just want to be entertained. It doesn't affect me. But what about your kids? And what about your neighbors? We know the Chinese are using TikTok as an intelligence tool, and Americans have willingly, for the sake of entertainment, handed their information over to China. And we're not saying we're going to get rid of TikTok. You can keep your TikTok and keep your entertainment. We just want China out of it so Americans are safe.
On the campaign front, Eric, we're watching Donald Trump in recent weeks use Christian imagery to appeal to voters. Obviously, the selling the Bible and some other comparing his legal woes also to the persecution of Christ. We've heard that rhetoric from him during the campaign trail as well. How effective do you think this strategy is in reaching the moderate voters that he'll need to reach this November?
I don't think it's effective at all. And I also think he, because of some of his positions lately in statements on abortion, he risks making evangelicals cynical to him. I don't this is a strategy that worked in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. I don't think this works in 2024. He's already got this base of people to vote for him. He risks alienating them by cheapening their gospel and by tying his abortion waffling to a position they care about, and he's got to reach out to moderate voters. Moderate voters care about pocketbook issues, not the Trump Bible. He needs to make the case that Joe Biden's economy is bad for them and his economy is good for them. It's working to a degree when he does that, but I think he probably needs to leave Jesus out of it.
Do you have a guess as to who he will ultimately pick as his VP? And what criteria do you think he's using to make that selection?
I think he wants to set himself up to show neutralize the white nationalist talking points the left uses. So I think that helps him with maybe someone like Tim Scott from South Carolina. He also wants to broaden his pool of voters. And again, I think Tim Scott makes sense. Rubio and DeSantis in Florida makes sense, except because Trump has moved his residency to Florida. The 12th Amendment of the Constitution says you can't have a president and vice president from the same state, or that electoral college vote doesn't count. So he will, or they would have to move residency to make it work. It's possible Bush and Cheney had done that. At the same time, though, I think probably Kristi Noem and her dog story alienates her from him, that she's not going to be it. So I would look to someone like Tim Scott. Doug Burgum from North Dakota is being floated. Burgum brings money that Trump needs, but also I don't know that he expands the pool of voters that a Tim Scott would.
Yeah, when you were watching some of these people enter the race during the beginning of the primary, you wonder, why is Governor Doug Burgum getting in? Why we're starting to see why people like that enter presidential races, not necessarily to win the nomination, but to get their names up front for situations like this. Eric, if people want to listen to your show and find out more about what it is you're doing, your socials, how do they do that?
You know, the easiest thing is to text my name, Eric, Erick, to 33777. They can get all my show links, website, show notes, podcast, live stream, whatever they want.
Eric Erickson, host of the Eric Erickson Show. Thank you so much for joining me here on the DC Debrief. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.